The sun was a merciless eye in the cloudless Arizona sky, beating down on the ramshackle trading post known as Devil's Rest. It wasn't much, a handful of weathered buildings huddled around a well that barely gave up brackish water, but it was the only refuge for 50 miles in any direction through the unforgiving desert. Sarah Mackenzie wiped the sweat from her brow as she swept the porch of Hutchins' General Store, her calico dress already showing the dust of another scorching day. At 19, she had the kind of beauty that drew attention in a place where decent women were scarce. Auburn hair that caught the light, green eyes that spoke of intelligence, and a spirit that hadn't yet been broken by the harsh realities of frontier life. She'd come to Devil's Rest 3 months ago with her aunt after her parents died of fever back in Kansas. Her aunt ran the small boarding house, and Sarah helped wherever she could, trying to make an honest living in a place where honesty was often a luxury few could afford. The thundering of hooves announced trouble before Sarah even looked up. 5 riders emerged from the heat shimmer of the desert, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces shadowed beneath the brims of worn hats. These weren't travelers seeking water and shelter, these were men running from something, and that made them dangerous. The leader dismounted with a casual arrogance that made Sarah's stomach tighten. Jake Carver was a name whispered in fear across 3 territories. Tall and lean, with pale eyes that seemed to find amusement in others' misfortune, he wore his reputation like a badge. The 4 men with him were cut from the same cloth, hard men who lived by taking what they wanted. "Well, well," Carver drawled, his voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the trading post. "Ain't this a pretty sight?" Sarah felt every eye in the settlement turn toward her. The handful of other residents, old Hutchins, the blacksmith Murphy, and a few passing traders, seemed to shrink back into the shadows of their doorways. She knew that look in their eyes. They were good people, but they were also outnumbered and outgunned. In a place like Devil's Rest, survival often meant looking the other way when trouble came calling. "Ma'am," Carver touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "Jake Carver's the name. Heard tell this little outpost has been doing right well for itself lately. Thought we might contribute to the local economy." Sarah's hands tightened on the broom handle. "The store's open for business," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you need supplies, you can speak to Mr. Hutchins." Carver's laugh was like the sound of bones rattling in a grave. "Oh, I think we'll be needing more than supplies, miss. You see, we've been riding hard for 3 days now, and my boys are getting mighty restless. A place like this, well, it needs to show proper hospitality to weary travelers." Behind him, his men spread out in a half-circle, hands resting casually on their gun butts. The message was clear. This wasn't a request. "There's a boarding house down the street," Sarah said, taking a step back toward the store's door. "My aunt, your aunt." Carver's pale eyes gleamed. How considerate. "But I was thinking more immediate accommodations might be in order." The world seemed to slow as Carver stepped up onto the porch, his boots heavy on the worn wooden planks. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized how completely alone she was. The other townspeople had melted away like snow in summer, and she couldn't blame them. What could they do against 5 armed men? "Please," she whispered, hating how small her voice sounded. "I haven't done anything to you." "No, you surely haven't," Carver agreed, reaching out to touch a strand of her hair. "But you're about to do something for us. See, my boys and we've had a long, hard ride, and we deserve a little compensation for our troubles." Sarah jerked away from his touch, and that's when his hand shot out like a striking snake, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. She cried out, more in fear than pain, and the sound seemed to break whatever spell of paralysis had held the settlement in its grip. But it was too late. Carver's men had positioned themselves perfectly, and when old Hutchins appeared in his doorway with a shotgun, he found himself staring down the barrel of 2 Colt .45s. "Easy there, old man," one of the outlaws called out. "Wouldn't want you to do something foolish and get yourself hurt." Carver dragged Sarah down into the dust of the street. and she could see the terrible understanding in the eyes of the people watching from their hiding places. They wanted to help. She could see it in their faces, but they were trapped by the simple mathematics of violence. 5 professional killers against a handful of shopkeepers and farmers was no contest at all. "You boys keep an eye on our neighbors," Carver called to his men, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Make sure they understand the importance of minding their own business." Sarah struggled against his grip, but Carver was surprisingly strong for his lean build. "Please," she gasped. "Please, just take what you want from the stores and leave. I'm nobody important. I don't have anything." "You got exactly what we want, sweetheart," Carver said, and his voice had taken on a rougher edge. "See, when you're living the life we live, you learn to appreciate the finer things when you find them, and you—" He looked her up and down with an expression that made her skin crawl. "You're about the finest thing we've seen in a month of Sundays." The tears came then, hot and shameful, as Sarah realized that no one was coming to help her. This was the reality of the frontier. Sometimes good people suffered simply because they were in the wrong place when bad men came calling. The desert didn't care about justice or fairness. It only cared about who was stronger. But as Carver began to drag her toward the small barn behind the trading post, something moved at the edge of Sarah's vision. A shadow detached itself from the rim of the canyon that overlooked the settlement, and for just a moment she thought she saw the silhouette of a man on horseback watching. Then Carver yanked her forward, and the moment was lost in dust and terror. The barn smelled of hay and old leather, and the shadows inside seemed to press in around Sarah like living things. Carver had dragged her inside while his men positioned themselves around the settlement, creating a perimeter that no one could cross without being seen. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, she could see the townspeople huddled in their doorways, their faces tight with helpless anger and fear. "Now then," Carver said, pushing her toward a pile of hay bales stacked against the far wall. "Let's get better acquainted." Sarah's mind raced, searching for some way out, some hope of escape or rescue. But the harsh reality was inescapable. She was alone with a killer, and no one was coming to save her. "My aunt will pay you," she said desperately. "Whatever you want, she'll—" "Your aunt's got nothing I want," Carver interrupted, advancing on her with predatory patience. "But you're going to make this whole detour worthwhile." Outside, she could hear the casual conversation of Carver's men as they kept watch. They were talking about the weather, about their horses, about where they might head next, as if what was happening in the barn was just another mundane part of their day. The normalcy of it was somehow more terrifying than outright threats would have been. Sarah backed against the hay bales, her hands searching blindly for anything she could use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around the handle of a pitchfork, and she raised it with trembling hands. Carver stopped, looking at the crude weapon with amusement. "Now that's just insulting," he said. "You think I got where I am by being scared of farm tools?" He moved forward again, and Sarah thrust the pitchfork toward him with all her strength. But Carver had faced armed men in gunfights. A frightened girl with a pitchfork was barely an inconvenience. He sidestepped easily and grabbed the handle, twisting it from her grip and tossing it aside. "That wasn't very friendly," he said. And now there was an edge of real anger in his voice. "I was planning to be gentle about this, but maybe you need to learn some manners first." His hand flashed out and struck her across the face, the blow sending her sprawling into the hay. Stars exploded across her vision, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut her lip. "Please," she gasped, the word barely audible. "Please don't—" The barn door creaked. Carver spun around, his hand dropping to his gun, but the doorway was empty. The door swayed slightly in the hot breeze, and beyond it, the settlement looked exactly as it had moments before. His men at their posts, the townspeople in their hiding places, everything normal. "Tom!" Carver called out to one of his men. "You see anybody moving around out there?" "Negative, boss," came the reply. "All quiet on our end." Carver frowned, studying the door for a long moment before turning back to Sarah. "Where were we?" But Sarah was staring past him at the doorway, where a shadow had appeared so silently that it might have been a trick of the light. The figure that filled the frame was tall and lean, dressed in simple clothes that spoke of someone who lived close to the land. His dark hair was long and unbound, and his face bore the weathered features of the desert tribes that had called this land home for countless generations before the first white settlers arrived. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stood there, watching. Carver followed Sarah's gaze and turned, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. When he saw the Apache standing in the doorway, his face twisted into a sneer. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Look what the wind blew in. You lost, boy? This here's a private conversation." The Apache, for that's clearly what he was, though Sarah had never seen one up close before, said nothing. His dark eyes moved from Carver to Sarah, taking in her disheveled appearance and the bright red mark on her cheek. Something flickered in those eyes, and Sarah found herself holding her breath. "I said, get lost." Carver's voice was louder now, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "This ain't none of your concern, Redskin." Still, the Apache didn't respond. He took a step into the barn, his movements fluid and silent. He was unarmed as far as Sarah could see, no gun, no knife, nothing but the quiet confidence of a man who didn't need weapons to be dangerous. Carver's hand closed around the grip of his Colt. "You deaf as well as stupid. I'm giving you one chance to walk away before I put a bullet in you." For the first time, the Apache's gaze shifted to meet Carver's eyes directly, and in that moment, Sarah saw something that made her heart race with sudden hope. This wasn't a man who could be intimidated. This wasn't someone who would back down or look the other way. "Tom, Red, get in here!" Carver shouted, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Heavy footsteps approached the barn, and two of Carver's men appeared in the doorway, their hands already on their weapons. When they saw the Apache, they exchanged glances. "Want us to handle this, boss?" one of them asked. Carver was silent for a moment, studying the Apache's face. Sarah could see him weighing his options. 3 armed men against 1 unarmed Indian should have been no contest at all. But there was something about the Apache's stillness, his complete lack of fear, that was unsettling. 3 of us, Carver said finally, as much to reassure himself as to threaten. "One of you. I'd say the odds are pretty clear." The Apache's response was to take another step forward. Not aggressive, not threatening, just forward. As if 3 armed killers were no more concerning to him than 3 scarecrows in a field. And that's when Sarah saw it. The slight widening of Carver's eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. For the first time since she'd known his name, Jake Carver was uncertain. "You boys keep him covered," Carver said to his men. "If he so much as twitches wrong, put him down." But the Apache's attention had shifted back to Sarah. Their eyes met across the shadowed barn, and she saw something there that she'd never expected to see again. Hope. Not just for herself, but reflected back at her from someone who looked at her and saw not a victim, but a person worth standing up for. The Apache reached out his hand toward her, palm up. An invitation. An offer. "You take one more step," Carver snarled, "and we'll see how tough you really are." The Apache looked at him for a long moment. Then, deliberately, he took that step. The tension in the barn was thick enough to cut with a knife. 3 armed outlaws faced 1 unarmed Apache, and yet somehow the advantage didn't seem as clear as it should have been. Sarah pressed herself against the hay bales, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sound might shatter whatever fragile balance was keeping violence at bay. Carver's hand was steady on his gun, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in his eyes. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. People were supposed to be afraid of Jake Carver. They were supposed to run or hide or beg for mercy. They weren't supposed to just stand there. "I don't know what game you think you're playing," Carver said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "But you picked the wrong place and the wrong time to play hero." The Apache said nothing. He simply extended his hand toward Sarah again, that same patient gesture of invitation. "Come, you don't have to be afraid anymore." "Boss," one of Carver's men said nervously, "maybe we should just..." Should just what? Carver snapped. Let some savage waltz in here and tell us our business? I don't think so. But Sarah could hear something new in his voice, doubt. For a man like Carver, whose power came from fear and intimidation, doubt was poison. And the Apache's complete lack of fear was spreading that poison through the room like smoke. You want the girl that bad? Carver said, trying to regain control of the situation. Fine, we can share. Plenty to go around. The Apache's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time, Sarah saw real anger flash in his dark eyes. But still, he didn't speak. Still, he didn't reach for a weapon. He just stood there, radiating a quiet menace that was somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. Outside, Sarah could hear voices. The townspeople were starting to whisper among themselves, drawn by the unusual length of the confrontation. In a normal situation, this would have been over in seconds, one way or another. The fact that it was dragging on was creating ripples of confusion and hope throughout the settlement. Tom, Carver said to one of his men, go outside and make sure our friends don't get any foolish ideas. Tom hesitated. You sure you don't want me to stay here? 3-on-1 ain't exactly overwhelming odds when what? Carver's voice was sharp. When it's just one Indian, get outside and watch the street. Tom left reluctantly, and Sarah could feel the shift in the room's dynamics. 2 armed men against 1 unarmed Apache. Still, should have been no contest, but somehow the Apache seemed larger now, more imposing, as if removing one of his opponents had somehow made him stronger rather than his enemies weaker. The remaining outlaw, Red, Carver had called him, was starting to sweat despite the relative coolness of the barn's shade. Boss, he said quietly, something ain't right here. Indians don't usually, they're usually smarter than to... Shut up, Carver hissed. Just keep your gun on him and let me think. But thinking was becoming difficult. The Apache's presence was like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond the barn. Sarah could hear more voices outside now, and the sound of people moving around. The paralysis that had gripped the settlement was starting to break down. The Apache took another step forward. Not threatening, not aggressive, just closer. And somehow that simple movement made Carver take an involuntary step backward. That's far enough! Carver's voice cracked like a whip, but there was a tremor in it that hadn't been there before. I'm warning you, Jake. The voice came from outside the barn, and Sarah recognized it as belonging to old Hutchins. Jake, Carver! Carver's eyes flicked toward the door, his attention divided for just a moment. What? We got something to say to you. Sarah's heart leaped. The townspeople were finding their courage. Whatever spell of fear had held them paralyzed was breaking, and it was all because of the quiet man standing in the middle of the barn, refusing to be intimidated. You say it from out there, Carver shouted back, and make it quick. We've been talking, Hutchins called, and we decided we don't much like how you're treating our neighbors. Carver's face flushed red. Your neighbors? This here's between me and the girl. No, came another voice. Murphy, the blacksmith. It ain't. She's one of ours, and we're tired of hiding. More voices joined in, a growing chorus of anger and determination. Sarah couldn't make out all the words, but the message was clear. The people of Devil's Rest were taking a stand. And it was all because of the Apache. His refusal to be cowed, his quiet courage in the face of overwhelming odds, had shown them that sometimes you had to stand up and fight, even when the odds were against you. Red, Carver said urgently, go see how many of them are out there. I ain't leaving you alone with him, Red replied, his gun trained on the Apache's chest. I gave you an order. And I'm refusing it. Red's voice was tight with strain. Look at him, Jake. Look at his eyes. That ain't a man who's planning to go down easy. The Apache heard all of this without any change in expression. He simply stood there, patient as stone, waiting. For what, Sarah couldn't say, but she had the feeling that when the moment came, she would know. Carver was sweating now, his confident facade cracking under the pressure of circumstances spiraling beyond his control. 3 armed men should have been able to handle 1 unarmed Indian and a handful of shopkeepers. It should have been simple. But sometimes, Sarah realized, simple courage was the most powerful weapon of all. The Apache looked at her again, and this time she saw something new in his eyes. A question. "Are you ready?" Sarah didn't know what she was supposed to be ready for, but she found herself nodding anyway. Whatever was about to happen, she would face it standing up. The Apache smiled, just a slight curve of his lips, but it transformed his entire face. And in that moment, Sarah understood something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Sometimes, the most important battles were fought not with guns or violence, but with the simple refusal to back down when it mattered most. The moment came, like lightning splitting the sky. The Apache moved with fluid grace, not toward the Outlaws' guns, but toward Sarah. In 3 swift steps he was beside her, his hand gently touching her arm, helping her to her feet. And somehow, that simple gesture of protection was more threatening to Carver than any weapon could have been. "Get away from her!" Carver snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. "I'll put a bullet in you right now." But the Apache was already turning, placing himself between Sarah and the guns, his back straight and his stance unwavering. He still didn't speak, but his message was crystal clear. "You'll have to go through me." "Boss!" Red whispered urgently. "The whole town's gathering outside. We need to finish this." Carver's voice was raw with desperation. He'd built his reputation on fear, on being the man nobody dared to cross. If word got out that he'd been backed down by 1 unarmed Indian and a handful of shopkeepers, that reputation would be worthless. The barn door swung wide, and Tom stumbled inside, his face pale with panic. "Jake, we got a problem. There's 20 people out there, and they're all armed. Hutchins got his shotgun, Murphy's got a rifle, and they're talking about—" "I don't care what they're talking about!" Carver's shout echoed through the barn. "We're not backing down from a bunch of storekeepers and 1 half-breed." But even as he said it, Sarah could see the defeat in his eyes. The mathematics of violence that had seemed so simple when it was 5 outlaws against a defenseless settlement had become impossibly complex. Now it was 3 outlaws against an entire community that had found its courage. And at the center of it all stood the Apache, still silent, still unarmed, but somehow the strongest person in the room. "You know what I think?" Carver said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I think maybe we need to send a message, show these good people what happens when they interfere with Jake Carver's business." He raised his gun, pointing it directly at the Apache's chest. "Last chance, boy. Step aside or die where you stand." Sarah's heart stopped. This was it, the moment when everything would be decided. The Apache had no gun, no knife, no way to defend himself against 3 armed killers. All he had was his courage, and courage couldn't stop bullets. But the Apache didn't step aside. He didn't even flinch. He simply stood there, looking Carver directly in the eyes, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he spoke. No. 1 word, spoken quietly, but with such absolute conviction that it seemed to ring through the barn like a bell. Not a threat, not a challenge, just a simple refusal to let evil pass. Carver's finger tightened on the trigger, but something was wrong. His hand was shaking. The man who had killed dozens of people in cold blood was trembling like a leaf. "Jake," Red said urgently, "we need to go. Now, while we still can." "Shut up!" But Carver's voice was high and strained. The Apache's calm gaze was doing something to him, stripping away the carefully constructed mask of menace he'd worn for so many years. Under that steady, unflinching stare, he wasn't Jake Carver, feared killer. He was just a scared, angry man who had built his life on hurting people weaker than himself. Outside, the voices of the townspeople were growing louder, more confident. Sarah could hear Hutchins calling for Carver to come out with his hands up, could hear Murphy organizing the others into positions around the barn. The community that had seemed so powerless was finding its strength. "He ain't even armed," Tom said desperately. "Just shoot him and let's get out of here." But Carver couldn't pull the trigger. Something in the Apache's eyes, some quality of absolute fearlessness and moral certainty, had paralyzed him. He'd faced armed men before, men who fought back with gun and blade. He'd never faced someone who fought back with nothing but the force of their character. The Apache took a step forward, then another, walking slowly toward the barrel of Carver's gun, as if it were no more dangerous than a pointing finger. "Stay back!" Carver's voice cracked. "I'm warning you!" But the Apache kept walking, not fast, not aggressive, just steady, implacable, inevitable. And with each step, Carver seemed to shrink a little more. "I can't." Carver's gun hand was shaking so badly now that he couldn't have hit a barn from inside it. "I can't." The Apache reached out and gently pushed the gun aside. Carver didn't resist. The fight had gone out of him completely, drained away by the simple presence of someone who refused to be intimidated. "Jake Carver!" Hutchins' voice boomed from outside. "This is your last warning. Come out now, or we're coming in." Carver looked around the barn like a man waking from a nightmare. His carefully orchestrated plan had crumbled into chaos. His reputation lay in ruins, and he was surrounded by angry townspeople with nothing left to lose. "We're done here," he whispered. "Boss?" Red asked uncertainly. "I said we're done." Carver's voice was hollow, defeated. "Holster your guns." "We're leaving." "What about the girl?" Tom asked. Carver looked at Sarah, then at the Apache standing protectively beside her. "She's not worth dying for," he said, but Sarah could hear the lie in his voice. The truth was simpler and more devastating. He wasn't worth killing for. The three outlaws filed out of the barn like beaten dogs, their hands carefully away from their weapons. The townspeople parted to let them pass, but Sarah could see the steel in their eyes. These weren't the same frightened people who had hidden in doorways an hour ago. They had found their courage, and they wouldn't lose it again. Carver paused at his horse, looking back at the barn where the Apache stood silhouetted in the doorway. "What's your name?" he called out. The Apache was silent for a long moment. Then, "Does it matter?" Carver mounted his horse without another word. Within minutes, the five outlaws were disappearing into the desert heat shimmer. Their reign of terror ended not by superior firepower or clever strategy, but by one man's refusal to let injustice pass unchallenged. Sarah stepped out of the barn into the bright sunlight, the Apache beside her. The townspeople gathered around, their faces shining with pride and newfound confidence. They had discovered something important about themselves today, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they stood together. "Thank you," Sarah said to the Apache, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know your name." He smiled, and she saw warmth in his dark eyes that took her breath away. "I am called Neshoba," he said. "It means wolf in my language." "Neshoba," she repeated, tasting the unfamiliar syllables. "I'm Sarah Mackenzie." "I know," he said simply. "I have watched this place from the canyon for many days. I have seen your kindness to the travelers, your care for the old ones. When I saw you in danger..." He shrugged. "Some things must be stopped." "You could have been killed," she said. "Perhaps, but some things are worth the risk." They stood together in the dust of Devil's Rest's main street, surrounded by the grateful townspeople. And Sarah realized that her life had changed forever. Not because of the danger she had faced, but because of the courage she had witnessed. Neshoba had shown all of them, that sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil was simply the refusal to be conquered by it. As the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah looked up at the canyon rim where Neshoba had first appeared. She understood now why he watched from there, not as an outsider looking in, but as a guardian keeping vigil over those who needed protection. "Will you stay?" she asked. Neshoba followed her gaze to the canyon. "For a while," he said. "This place has good people. It deserves to be protected." And in that moment, Sarah knew that Devil's Rest would never be the same. They had learned something precious today, that courage was contagious, that standing up for what was right could inspire others to do the same, and that sometimes the quietest voices spoke the loudest truths. The outlaws were gone, but more importantly, the fear they had brought was gone with them. In its place was something stronger, the knowledge that ordinary people standing together could face down any darkness. As the first stars appeared in the desert sky, Sarah smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of character. But she was no longer afraid. She had seen what courage looked like, and she knew that when the time came, she would find it within herself. After all, she had learned from the best teacher of all, a man who had shown her that sometimes the most important battles were won not with weapons, but with the simple refusal to let evil pass unchallenged. The town of Devil's Rest slept peacefully that night, and high on the canyon rim, a lone figure kept watch over them all.